There once was a farmer who wished to increase the volume of milk produced by his cows. To do this, he inquired with a psychologist, an engineer, and a physicist. The psychologist told him, if you want your cows to produce more milk, you must make your cows happy. Paint the walls green so that they feel less restricted. The farmer responded, you insufferable pillock, that's a ridiculous idea. He then went to the engineer. The engineer told him, your milking machine is inefficient and you should buy a better one. The farmer said, you idiot, my milking machine runs on a V8 engine, it has more than enough power. He then went to the physicist. The physicist said, let us postulate that the cow is completely spherical with uniform density in a vacuum emanating milk in all directions, and before he could finish, the farmer had decked him in the face. We exist in a little tiny thing called the universe. Its contents include, well, all of space and time, which you should hopefully know quite well because, well, you live in it. You've experienced all 3 of the spatial dimensions it has to offer. Are there more? Frick it doesn't matter. You've also experienced the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey dimension that you'd think is constant, but then some German bloke in 1915 said no and dropped an absolute banger with 168 pages continually explaining why. You may be asking yourself, what the heck? Yeah, so am I. But that German guy was onto something. Actually, he belongs to a legacy of people who are onto something known as physicists. You know, just like the guy in the intro. These people tend to look at things, make some notes, change something, and then make notes on that. They like to keep doing that. This is known as an experiment. They, the physicists, claim that their end goal is to find the cause of things. They find out what things will cause things to happen and how changing things will change the things that happen. In the modern day, we call these people massive nerds. But do you want to know something even crazier? There's a subgroup of these nerds that are somehow even nerdier, and they call themselves theoretical physicists. What makes them nerdier is that instead of doing these experiments in the real world, they choose to model physical things in their heads using mathematics, which is a language that they made to communicate between nerds. The German fellow that I mentioned earlier, he was a theoretical physicist. His name was Einstein, by the way. The models that he made were built on the models by an old English guy named Isaac Newton. I think he was hit in the head and did some stuff on gravity. Who was influenced by an older French guy named René Descartes, who was influenced by a whole bunch of old Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes. Massive nerds! What is a model? A model, derived from the Latin word modulus, meaning a measure, is an informative representation of an object, person, or system. For theoretical physicists, the use of conceptual models is integral. They represent a system, and they consist of concepts that are used to help people know, understand, or simulate the subject that is represented by the model. Often, they are abstractions of things in the real world. Take, for example, one of the most popular models that physicists have to offer, the heliocentric model. A bit of backstory. For the longest time, people believed that the Earth was flat. Then we grew some big boy pants and stopped believing in that, or at least some of us did, and proposed a model where big spheres orbit big spheres. Now, because we humans are ever so humble, we automatically assumed that we were at the center and that everything revolved around us. It's only natural, the church said. We are God's greatest creation and thus we are at the center. Suddenly, the Polish polymath Nicholas Copernicus came in and writes a little note for his friends describing a model suggesting that we were indeed not at the center of the cosmos, and that we merely orbited a big ball of flame called the Sun. This idea would be preached by a clever little Italian philosopher called Giordano Bruno, who the church appreciated for spreading these ideas so much that they immersed him in warmth. But then, Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler would go on to use some of those good old mathematics to not only prove that we were orbiting the Sun, but that distant stars were also suns with their own planets, as well as the fact that their orbits were not exactly circular, rather in most cases being elliptical. So that's how the heliocentric model was born, only taking the lives of a few clever little scientists along the way. But there are a few problems with it, as it is not entirely accurate. You see, it is of course common knowledge that we can calculate the orbital velocity of a planet with this equation, with big G being a constant that the Newton fellow would determine existed, but we would not know the value of until Lord Henry Cavendish began to play around with his balls. M is of course the mass of the object that is being orbited, measured in kilograms, and R is the radius of the orbit, measured in meters. Makes sense, right? Except, in order for it to work, we need to make a few assumptions. First is that the object that is being orbited is uniform in mass, which it is usually not. Second, we assume that the object being orbited is perfectly spherical, which is fine, until you start using this equation for planets, in which case it is not fine because I don't know if you've ever been on a planet, but they tend to get a little imperfect on the crust. Finally, we assume that the orbit is perfectly circular, which likely it is not, because the universe doesn't care about your model. Yet, these equations are still used anyway. Not just by the common layman, but by genuine world-class scientists who send rockets and satellites into space. But why? How? How are we living with such inaccuracy, such uncertainty, such imperfection? Why are we using something that is fundamentally incorrect to define what is correct? Earlier, I mentioned that models were abstractions of the real world. Even earlier than that, I uttered, frick it doesn't matter. Those are the basics of abstraction. You take away the useless information, and you leave behind what matters. This is what we do with scientific models. We take the values that we want to find, keep the values that will help us find them, and remove the values that won't be useful. The ability to use models to represent our real world is so intrinsic to the world of fundamental physics that pretty much every equation that has been derived by a smart philosopher, scientist, or student of days old requires some variables to be left ignored. Some is quite the understatement here, as in this universe of diameter 93 billion light years and counting, there are quite literally limitless factors that you could consider while trying to calculate a variable. From the speed of the wind on a given day to the angle that your mum is sitting at while watching the television, the only way to truly determine something that will happen in the future is to hold the information of every single particle in the universe. To know the precise momentum and location of every atom is the only way to calculate any future value of momentum and location for these atoms. This is known as Laplace's demon. As a physicist, you will ignore thousands of values. You will ignore horizontal acceleration when calculating two-dimensional motion. You will ignore variations in temperature when working with circuits. You will ignore friction. You will ignore air resistance, and it will all be okay because the values that you obtain will be so close to the real value that we can use them to make the discovery. To conclude, I leave you with a quote from Aristotle: "It is the mark of an instructed mind to rest satisfied with a degree of precision which the nature of the subject permits, and not to seek exactness where only an approximation of the truth is possible."